Hi there.
Hi.
Welcome to Theory of Change. I'm Matthew Sheffield. Thanks for joining me today. So, today we've got a great program for you and another live show. We're going to be talking about the COVID-19 pandemic and how it is impacted by our media environment and especially in regards to vaccine reluctance. And so the guest I brought on today with me is Richard Carpiano. He is a public health sociologist who studies basically how the public thinks about medical information and how it works in relation to the media. So thank you for joining me today, Rich.
Well, thanks for having me. It's great to be here.
Great. So just tell us real quickly, how did you become interested in public health? And you have a medical background as well as sociology.
Yeah. So, I guess I've always been sort of split-brained in a sense that I've always been very interested in medical science and public health issues, going back to even my undergraduate days, as well as just really having a keen interest also in the social sciences. And so, that's really launched my career in a sense. Even my PhD is actually a joint hybrid of public health and sociology. And really, most of the work that I've focused on throughout my career has focused very much on how social and behavioral factors influence any range of health issues. But most recently, say a couple of years ago, really, the Disneyland measles pandemic, outbreak. It really was something that caught my attention, really fascinated me in terms of a really important issue that really intersected between social science and what we might think of as just viruses, and thinking of something as sort of basic sort of natural science. And really, ever since then, that sort of launched my concern with issues around hesitancy, public understanding of issues related to infectious disease and vaccines. But during COVID, it's really sort of expanded much more into really into so many bigger issues that I'm sure we're going to get into today in relation to really how the public kind of understands science, how science gets communicated, and what impacts that has for helping or, unfortunately, in a lot of cases, hindering public policy related to pandemic response or just even epidemic response for things that we're going to see now and we'll see in the future.
Yeah, exactly. And we're going to organize the discussion here today into several different sections just to keep it easier to digest for everybody. So we're focusing on COVID misinformation here, and we're looking at the different sources of it because it's important to note here that this is not a new phenomenon. Skepticism about vaccinations and misinformation about vaccines. This is not a new thing with regard to COVID. So we're going to look at some of the sources of those, and they are, for the purposes of this discussion, typical conspiracy theorists who can have ideas about other subjects, non-qualified actual medical doctors who are speaking outside of their field, and business types, that is, people who are concerned more with economic repercussions of the pandemic, and then also wannabe pundits or media figures. So that's the framework that we're going to look into. Let's focus first, Rich, if you don't mind, on the typical conspiracists. The conspiracy theories, they're endemic to human nature, are they not?
Completely. And COVID is just the latest iteration of them.
Mhm.
Well, and in a sense, it's been very much a perfect storm, given our political climate and political events that have occurred in the past few years too. And so we've seen a very concerning. Well, I'll back it up just a little bit. So, as somebody who studies the anti-vaccine movement, there was always lots of conspiracy theorizing around the arguments about big pharma and big medicine, in a sense, and having different sorts of schemes in order to profit, having having conflicts of interest. And really, as COVID came about, really sort of the anti-vaccine movement and that kind of thinking converge a lot more with other types of fringe and extremist groups that had their own conspiracies related to government and other sorts of, again, theorized bad faith actors and what exactly their motivations would be in a conspiracy theory sort of sense. And so even in the days before and the day of the insurrection at the Capitol, January 6th, we saw events that had this convergence or this sort of collective of grievance issues with people with spheres, I guess you could say, of interests and issues that had their own specific sorts of conspiracy theories tied into them. So things like we would see a convergence of people who generally had a background in the anti-vaccine movement, also showing up with people that were very much of sort of the Stop the Steal, other sorts of anti-government types of libertarian, extreme libertarian type groups as well. The Roger Stone, even at the same appearing at the same events as these individuals, and even people with backgrounds in other sort of medical, you could say, sort of denialism or medical trutherism in relation to science and whatnot. And so, I mean, that might seem a little afield from conspiracy theory, but at the heart of all of these groups is there is a significant buy-in to particular types of conspiracies, and you see that kind of conspiratorial thinking in the online chatter. Your volume kicked out, so I'm
sorry, I muted myself.
Oh, there you go.
Yeah, so can you talk a little bit about some of the prior vaccine movement conspiracies and some of the people involved with that before COVID, because they're still around, of course, but they were talking about other stuff in addition or earlier.
Yeah, it seems in some ways when we think about sort of maybe even just like, so anti-vaccine activism and beliefs are nothing new, and they're as old as vaccines themselves. But when we think about sort of like the modern version of this, even if we want to go back about 20 years or so, even though it dates, even some of the current things that we're seeing dating before that and back into the 90s, we can think it becomes very difficult sometimes to draw a line between like where exactly does the misinformation sort of suddenly become the conspiracy thinking sort of beliefs, and sort of there's a blending there at certain points. Well, many people might be very familiar with the Andrew Wakefield controversy over his research in regards to making the claims that the MMR vaccine was related to autism, and then how that got amped through celebrities like Jenny McCarthy. I mean, Jenny McCarthy takes a lot of heat for this, but in many respects, it's Oprah Winfrey who really kind of gave a lot of the platform to that and a lot of medical and misinformation through her program, through the Dr. Oz's and Dr. Phil's, and Christiane Northrup is another MD who she gave a lot of attention to, and so really gave a lot of fuel to a lot of medical misinformation. But related to vaccines, over time we've seen the rise of a much more sort of organized, much more organized activity in relation to different organizations. For example, like Children's Health Defense, which is headed up by Robert F. Kennedy Jr., someone who had, prior to this, had a fairly legitimate sort of reputation within the environmental activism sort of world, and kind of really moved into this, we can just say it, sort of really jumped the shark into this sort of pseudoscience of vaccine activism. And other individuals as well. Del Bigtree would be another one who has partnered up with Andrew Wakefield long after his paper was discredited, Bigtree has a background in television, had been a producer for Dr. Oz and the Doctors, if I recall correctly, and had just completely moved into this, where he became essentially him, Robert F. Kennedy Jr., Wakefield, as well as a few others, have become basically celebrities within the national anti-vaccine activism sort of movement, and have taken on much more sort of strategic, organized efforts, as well as courted funding and really have propagated a lot of mistruths that really do feed into, I think you could say, more sort of latent types of beliefs that and fears that people might have around government and unregulated, unregulation of the medical field to whatever degree that might be accurate for say pharmaceuticals and things of that nature. But nevertheless, that's what features into that type of thinking. But overall, I mean, so while there was a lot of bunk science that was getting pushed and getting argued, and a lot of you could say these beliefs started to become sort of common knowledge and filtering in to the general public, and so became misinformation that then got circulated amongst people who were just legitimately asking questions or had concerns while seeing these things. I mean, you're seeing these things on media, celebrities are saying them, you're a parent. It's completely understandable why people might have questions, and then they go online and they find these things, and risks and fears that they tap into, especially in North American culture, where children are really often very viewed as sort of this project. It's a very intensive project for parents to be undertaking, in a sense. Model we call kind of intensive parenting. So where I was going with that was just to say that over time, though, we've seen this move much more into more political rhetoric, particularly as government has tried to respond to declining vaccination rates in particular states, for example, and trying to prevent. We've seen a few outbreaks that have occurred over the past few years of measles that didn't need to happen. And so in response to that, we've seen now this organization kind of moving more towards state houses, where the debates are less about the science and much more about values, and they become much harder to try to refute, to argue, and they certainly feed much more into this kind of conspiratorial thinking about government wanting to do bad things, and all the other sorts of visualizations and visceral kinds of language that get used about harm towards children and whatnot that gets brought up by these individuals, state level organizations, and others who are just, you could say, sort of maybe sympathetic or fellow travelers.
Yeah, well, and as the political component, as you noted earlier, it has become particularly popular for a long time among more libertarian, extreme libertarian types who regard like there was in the people kind of don't remember this now, but in the 1950s and 60s there was a big controversy among far right types about fluoride in public utility water because
which still exists. Also, that debate,
and it still exists. That's right. Yeah, people still believe this stuff, and basically they came to the conclusion that the government does not have the authority to protect public health, even though if you look at history. Even in the United States, or even the ancient world, like that has been something that governments have done as a responsibility throughout history. So, and it's kind of converged that you had this movement of people that were, they may not have necessarily had political ideas attached to it, and they were politically heterodox. I mean, Jenny McCarthy and Robert F. Kennedy Jr. certainly are not Republicans by any stretch of the imagination, but they had built a framework for questioning medical science, and it was sort of basically bolted on. Would you say?
Absolutely. And a lot of these. A lot of these arguments, I think, how you're framing them, you're absolutely right. I mean, public health has been a core government function, even from a libertarian standpoint. I mean, one could even make the argument that in terms of providing like basic government in terms of safety, that public health very much fits into that type of thinking about government in that respect. But I think. Too, we just do not understand in our country. Well, The way I like to think about it is, and how we come to think about public health, especially lately about public health as maybe being intrusive or overstepping, is that so much of what public health does is collective or population sort of focused and community sort of focused, which is very different in terms of how Americans think about their health. Particularly over the in the past several decades, really and past century, as we often think about major killers, things that we're going to die, as things that are related to ourselves and our bodies. And we see this now in this dialogue around about health liberty and about the choice to be vaccinated or not. We see with the current COVID vaccine debates too, or whether or not to wear a mask. So we think about health in
It's
terms
about
of these,
yourself. Yeah, it's about
yeah,
yourself, not
and we
about
don't really
others.
think, about how behaviors that we might have, do have an impact on other people. And we've been very privileged to not have to experience, in a very long time, a major infectious disease outbreak. And so to try to get around that type of thinking is very tricky, particularly when individualism is really so ingrained in kind of the cultural DNA of our nation. And
Yeah.
that libertarian sort of ethos. We all have it to a certain degree, but it's, again, for lots of people that really just see this as it's all about me. They seem to be missing the other core part of what is our social contract. Even if you're going to be you're full card carrying libertarian, which is you can do things that you want provided they don't harm other people. And so really with public health, I mean, so much of the ethics around public health are very much about the needs of the many really outweigh the needs of the individual. There's an attempt to try to balance those needs, of course. But as public health efforts really focus on populations, and public health law backs it up, really, again, the community takes precedence, which is a very different thing than the usual bioethical discussions we might see on the news. Say somebody is say on life support, whether whether we should stop life support for the person. We see those
Or
controversies every now and then.
abortion.
Abortion, exactly.
Yeah. All right. Well, and I think it's worth pointing out here that what's called American conservatism currently, it wasn't originally called conservatism. It was actually called individualism. When you look at the early literature of William F. Buckley and some of his predecessors, that's what they called what they were doing. They didn't call it conservatism. All right. So going back to our framework here. So the typical conspiracists have been joined in some cases by actual doctors, medical doctors, who have fully credentialed degrees, but they're not in a relevant area. And can you talk a little bit about some of the doctors that we're talking about, and it kind of fits in, I think, is an outgrowth of some of what you were talking about with this idea of alternative medicine, or strange treatments that you hear about on Oprah Winfrey or in your spam folder. Talk about that phenomenon a little bit, if you could.
Certainly. Now, there's certainly individuals that have a sort of a long history of sort of questionable sorts of practices. I mean, I would think that Dr. Oz is probably maybe one of the first ones that would come to mind as sort of being one of these, chasing celebrity and maybe chasing the spotlight, arguably, versus, really trying to keep to, some sort of professional sort of standards around what he trained in and what he's practiced, all these years. But COVID has certainly brought out a number of other individuals with, in this case, who are, again, like Oz is a cardiac surgeon. Has had a very established sort of career with that, and we see similar types like that now during COVID, who have really kind of sought the spotlight, sought particular types of influence, and either going on cable news, or in certain cases, seeking more policy influence. So the people that come to mind, most immediately, to me, at least, if we're going to do word association with it, is Scott Atlas, sort of really being the COVID whisperer, I guess you could say.
And who is Scott Atlas?
Sorry, so Scott Atlas, yes, right. For those who don't know, was a Stanford affiliated MD. Who then moved over in his career. He was a very respected believe he was a radiologist by training, wrote some medical education textbooks around it, totally real deal. Moved to then the Hoover Institution, which is also at Stanford University, but is well known as a conservative think tank, very partisan in that regard. And moved was trying to pursue a second career in essence, or second act in relation to health policy. If you go to look up his work, it didn't necessarily have that much of an impact, at least in.
Well, he was trying to get a second career, but not any without doing any academic work.
Exactly. Yeah. So as far as I know, has no background in policy or to move into that realm. Yeah. And then, suddenly out of the blue, he became, in a sense, a household name to many through Trump press conferences, where really he became, in essence, the counterpoint to Anthony Fauci, who was the actual real deal expert, and a very well respected, one of the most well respected, you could say, in the world, infectious disease specialists. And so, and in that case, providing guidance, providing thoughts to the president after being briefed by a range of experts, of public health experts, or at least it has how it might have been communicated to him via, say, Mike Pence, who was assigned to the COVID task force at the time period. So that would be one example of it. Another example that we've seen too would be Marty McCary, who is often writing Wall Street Journal op-eds, has been a Fox News sort of regular, but again, another person with no background in public health. And has been making different sorts of predictions that have not really sort of panned out, taken very contrarian sorts of viewpoints of a very sort of partisan kind of nature to what is his public health guidelines.
Yeah, sorry. And what is his medical background for those who don't know it?
Yeah, it's escaping me at this time period. But again, it's not a background.
He's an actual doctor.
He is an actual MD. Yes, he is, but with not a formal background in, say, public health, epidemiology, or in an area that we might think to be particularly sort of relevant to the issues at the time period. So those stand out to me as sort of two examples of that. But we also saw some sort of smaller market, I guess we should say down market type MDs as well, that have been pursuing much more of sort of the partisan news spotlight, who are MDs and pushing discredited sort of science, or very questionable, to be very generous, questionable type of science, or claims related to COVID and COVID response, that are in essence, really polluting, you could say, the information sphere, that how the average person is coming to understand and recognize sort of the risks, and how to properly take action to protect themselves and protect their community against COVID. For one example would be here in California, we had two physicians who work with some emergent care type centers who had they suddenly did a press conference that was really just held at one of their own buildings, and about their research. So I put my air quotes up, I guess, a little too early when I should have said research. In that it was really just a very basic sort of analysis that honestly somebody like a first-year epidemiology student in graduate school would have been able to would have known the problems and the limitations of. But this caught a lot of attention. It was related to, they were trying to downplay sort of the significance of COVID, and really what sort of the overall prevalence of it was. And rather than, as we would normally do in a press conference of any sort of research, where we would go into about our findings and really talk about them extensively and keep it about the science, and maybe make some recommendations sort of based off of that, it was an opportunity to spout a lot of conspiracy theory things around, I have friends in ERs at other places in the country, and the people that are coming in, spreading a lot of misinformation around COVID diagnosis and how that would affect the numbers and maybe potentially overblow things. And those two doctors went around and were doing a lot of the conservative talking rounds, you could say, in terms of radio, in terms of television. Fox News booked them, for example, but then more local market type things as well. I bring them up as sort of an example. They're not the only ones. Simone Gold, who is one of the founders of America's Frontline Doctors, has been another individual kind of doing that, but was also caught at the Capitol during the insurrection and is now facing some charges related to that. So in essence, we can kind of, my point here is to try to bring up, that it's not even just around the sphere of medicine per se, but it's moved into politics more broadly in terms of these kinds of social movements that we're seeing as well.
Yeah, and there was even another doctor who kind of blended the conspiracy and the unqualified medical ideas. Her name is Stella Emanuel. I don't know if you remember her. She's claims that the disease is caused by sex with demons. And unfortunately, she's still around, and some people still believe her that she has good ideas about responding to COVID.
And the parchment on the wall says medical doctor.
That's right. Yeah, unfortunately. And I think, the common denominator between all these groups that we're talking about here today is that, we can see that just because you have some knowledge or an ability to or some familiarity with a relevant subject matter, it doesn't mean that you know the full background of it. And in the case of somebody who's a surgeon or a general practitioner doctor, you really don't know what you're talking about. But there are so many people out there that are taking these people seriously. I mean, you've got this other guy named Brett Weinstein, who is an evolutionary biologist, and he's telling his viewers on YouTube, and YouTube has not taken these videos down. He's telling them, in this house, my wife and I, we're not pursuing vaccines because we believe in ivermectin. And ivermectin is just the latest, fantasy miracle. That's right. Yeah. It's hydroxychloroquine 2.0. And their audience doesn't know, and they're not telling their audience that they're not qualified to talk about this stuff. I mean, do you think it's a problem that you have these doctors out there? I mean, are medical associations or state medical boards, has there been something that people have talked about taking action against such unqualified advice?
Yeah, there's sort of been a movement afoot. At least one of the state medical boards, I'm forgetting which one. I want to say Florida, but I might be wrong on that. Is really now trying to take a position about how spreading medical misinformation is really against best practices, and seems to be taking a more vested interest in basically keeping tabs on people that it's licensing and the way the practices are working. Those doctors that I talked about earlier, in terms of their study, and that was immediately rebuked by a professional. They're both emergency physicians, or at least they're some sort of credential with them. But one of the national organizations for emergency medicine came out immediately with a statement that said, that to discredit their findings, and spoke out against them. There is some activity afoot. Now, of course, I don't want to conflate professional associations with medical boards, and those are two separate things. But I think those are two important avenues through which there needs to be regulation on this. That it is really it's a complete violation of, in a way, the Hippocratic Oath to be engaging in the activities that people are doing. Although it does get very tricky in terms of sort of amassing enough of the evidence and making it, at what point does someone cross the line? And so it sounds like so many things. It sounds like a great idea in theory, but putting it into practice becomes a lot more tricky. It's not to say it can't be done, but I really think I think there needs to be more action with it. We need to be having more serious discussions around it within professional communities and medical boards and the like, because it's clear that the public reputation smears, or even just sort of a stigma by your own colleagues is not enough to stop these people and kind of keep them in check.
Yeah. All right. So just moving along in our framework here. So we've got business types. People. Why don't you talk about that? What does that mean in terms of public health with regard to COVID-19?
Well, business types could encompass a lot of different angles with that. You could think about just the people that have been pushing for a long time, putting an emphasis on, or I should say, making this into sort of a false dichotomy between COVID responses, either public health or it's the economy, and it's one or the other. When we know that's not the case, and that the two are very much complementary. So we've certainly seen sort of emphases on that, on definitely on opening up, and so as a result, a lot of confirmation bias, or at least amping of contrary type views as a way to try to support their point that either that COVID maybe is no big deal, that it is, the risk is sort of minimal, and that things are overblown, and that really lives are being there's just too many unintended consequences and collateral damage to people's livelihoods and businesses as a result of this. And so we can see that within sort of professional, within influence upon local officials. We've been seeing this certainly within Southern California, within Orange County and other places. So we see well, one of the most prominent, actually, probably 2 weeks ago, sort of as an example of this, would be a business owner, Italian restaurant owner by the name of Tony Roman, who runs a restaurant in Orange County, where he had a sign up that was that basically said he wanted to serve the unvaccinated, or he wanted to give preference to those patrons. However you would prove that, obviously but this was like the latest of many sorts of public stunts that he's pulled in terms of defiance of public health orders. And with that has courted a lot of media attention. It's probably drummed up a lot of business for him in terms of, appealing to a particular sort of base crowd. Along with that, had a very embarrassing sort of national cable news interview with Chris Cuomo about a week or two ago, along with this, and has used this as a opportunity, along with he's not the only one, but there's lots of people, particularly we've seen it here in Southern California, what I like to call protest entrepreneurs. So they're people who have, in response to COVID and sort of their outrage about the government response to it, have really sought out some sort of attention. But it could be profit driven, it could be status or influence oriented, and in essence, really to get attention about counter issues. And so have really created a new sort of enterprise related to everything that's anti-COVID. And so it does get wrapped up or sort of sold in terms of some sort of political statement with a lot of phony science sometimes to back it up. But then, you go to a lot of these websites and there's donate buttons and there's merchandise to be sold. And with that, lots of, the way social media and other opportunities, YouTube and other things afford us, there's so many different ways now to get fan followings and get attention for yourself. And so within that type of circle, these individuals have really sort of found fame in many respects. And so, Roman is certainly one notable example of that, but there's other ones as well. Some who have originally maybe had a background in maybe the anti-vaccine movement, but others who I've never heard of before until COVID popped up, and we started to see them appear at protests, the anti-lockdown protests, and their issues span beyond, again, just sort of public health to much more of a broader anti-government sort of worldview or platform. And in that respect, it gets them lots of of attention and allies, you could say, with people in those other sorts of spheres. People who might not have had any interest whatsoever, maybe in vaccines, or they might be fully vaccinated for all we know, or would have necessarily maybe have supported these people in the past in terms of any sort of maybe alternative science, I guess you could say, or bunk science. But now, really, this has become sort of a coalition of kind of common bedfellows in that way. So there is a sort of a profit opportunity there, whether it's monetary or through some other sorts of capital, influence, attention, likes, even in that respect, and just really a microphone. So that, I would say that's the big part of the business component that we're seeing.
Yeah, and I think that dovetails also with the last type here, which is the wannabe medical pundits. And that's become, I think that kind of overlays all these other classes, but they're also their own group as well. And just recently today, as a matter of fact, one of the best known COVID wannabe pundits, Nate Silver of 538, got himself in trouble. I'm going to put up the tweet exchange on the screen here. There's a biologist named Carlberg, and he's written a lot about the epidemic and virology, and so he was posting a basic reminder to people that vaccine effectiveness is about not only people, or like immunity is a function of both having had COVID and also being vaccinated. And we can know who would be immune from, roughly immune from dying by their vaccination rate, but people who are not vaccinated, well, we don't know how effective immunity they would have. And then Nate Silver, who is known more for his sports analysis and his politics analysis, decided to claim that Bergstrom had stolen this idea from him. And he said, well, it's no problem because I'm glad it's getting more visibility, but you're kind of stealing this take from me. Which is an interesting use of the word take there, I think. And then Bergstrom replies back, well, first of all, this is common knowledge in epidemiology, not some brilliant discovery on your part. And then second, I even referenced my source who had written it before you did yourself, and I don't even follow you. So that was really quite a slapdown, but it's one that a lot of people have been wanting to see coming, because Silver is one of this new class of people who, are much less relevant in non-election times, and interest in sports has declined quite a bit as well. So traffic to his sites, just down, and so now he's decided to get involved in COVID analyzing, but he's not the only one. Talk a little bit about this idea of media influencers chasing likes here, if you could.
Yeah, so there's a really a broad spectrum of this. I've written a little bit about this and been thinking a lot about it, and I think COVID has really, I think, brought this to the fore in terms of its contributions to misinformation and going just confusion, I would say. And that, you could think on one end of the spectrum, you have these sort of non-experts like Silver, like Matthew Iglesias would be another example, the blogger types that are, for better or for worse, you could say in the 21st century, at least in 2021, are sort of our equivalent of sort of a public intellectual. We could debate that one all day long. But in essence, again, they make their business off of social commentary and getting discussions sort of going. But then as you move along the spectrum, there are people who are relatively more sort of qualified to talk about particular topics, and in some cases just may not be fully there and consistently have bad takes or incomplete sorts of takes with that, but have maybe a little bit more legitimacy because they might have a certain degree, or Eric Feigl-Ding, for example, comes to mind for this, a very prominent during COVID influencer who has a PhD, but in epidemiology, I believe it's nutritional epidemiology though, but has tweeted extensively and has even been sought for his supposed expertise out by, I believe it was New Jersey, regarding his, in terms of COVID response. And so it's really kind of parlayed this into kind of an influencer career, as well as really hyping a Harvard mailbox that he had, even though he was, not, I guess, not full faculty there. But then you move along, you have other individuals like Emily Oster has come up, has had a lot of, has received lots of criticism over some of her takes on regards to schooling. She's an economist by training, has some qualifications for the things that she studies, but certainly, is certainly an influencer and has, there's been a bit of debate about some of her positions. Zeynep Tufekci, if I'm saying her name correctly, is I believe she's an American Studies or Communications scholar. She describes herself as a sociologist with no background whatsoever in public health, but has written extensively through already having a platform through the New York Times and the Atlantic for things that I know my bench scientist network really gets their nose out of joint reading her work. It's really not fully informed. But then you can move even further along, and then you have people who are, you could say maybe are MD contrarians, and are always trying to provide a hot take to get attention on a lot of issues. For example, but may not have any sort of public health background. One person who definitely comes to mind on that, who's received that criticism, is Vinay Prasad, who another person who has a big following, had a big following probably before COVID, and has always tried to, I shouldn't say always, but has very frequently offered particular types of takes that the people within the public health community have taken issue with. And then you even have individuals, MDs with infectious disease backgrounds. Monica Gandhi is another prominent example of that. You could say sort of maybe on more on the more fully to the other end of the spectrum, who offers, there's a mix there. There are certain things I would not disagree with her, but there are other times I've taken issue and others have taken with her for how certain sorts of statistics are reported or used to sort of push a particular opinion, and or has had particular takes on different emerging, so you could say, chapters of the pandemic or different sorts of issues that have not necessarily panned out or have been maybe factually sort of wrong and been challenged by virologists and others. And so really, so where I'm going with this is, so you have this very interesting, it's not even sort of, you could say it falls on like one axis. It's sort of this multi-axis sort of classification of influencers that are out there, with the social media being what it is, and I guess you could say our mediascape being what it is in 2021, there's lots of opportunities for influence and to be heard. And while there's lots of people out there, like Carl Bergstrom is, I think, a fantastic example of this. Peter Hotez would be another good one, of people you could think of as influencers, but are really, are people who are really just concerned about doing science communication. They're not in it for any sort of real, to make a brand of themselves or anything like that. They just want to do the good thing. I try to do the same thing as a professor. It's part of my job, although I don't have nearly the following of any of these people. And communicate to the public, and kind of do good in terms of public engagement. So you've got you could say that group too are influencers, but for good, in many respects. Not to say that there isn't good that comes out of some of those other people, but to the extent to which our mediascape really is not really sort of regulated and presents this opportunity for audiences, there becomes this, and I think very similar to a Dr. Oz or these other doctors even that we've talked about before, or even the protest entrepreneurs, an opportunity to gain influence that can, I think, at times be a bit tempting. And for somebody that might be very inclined to, with a particular sort of motive to it, I'm not even going to ascribe motive to any of these people, I think that does become a temptation in a way, and I think that's a very generous one. I think to ascribe to people like Silver or some of the bloggers.
Yeah, well, and the thing that they may not realize, so they're certainly not nearly as misinformative or disinformative as, let's say, Alex Jones or Joe Rogan even. But what they're doing is that by putting ideas out there about public health that they don't understand and which are often proved to be incorrect, what they're doing is increasing skepticism of actual public officials who have been, who have dedicated years of their lives to this subject matter. And, so even if, like, let's say they never say something like, don't get vaccinated, don't wear a mask. Like, even if they don't say that, what they're doing is undermining public confidence in a subject that matters a lot.
Yes, and that's my point. Yeah, and so this may sound just like I'm just naming names and just kind of trash talking and everything else. My point here is, and I'm coming at this as from a social science sort of standpoint with it, is if you can classify sort of these into kind of these, you could think of almost sort of ideal types of influencers, put them into particular categories. And I have noticed too that there's really are there are tactics that are either somewhat unique, or you could say, kind of span those different sorts of categories in terms of how they communicate their messages. So in certain cases, there are people who could be very well intended, but I named some MDs for example, in that last group, and some others as well, but who, in terms of trying to court an audience and using social media, it just creates more confusion, and it really just kind of pollutes the information sphere that's already at this point been very clogged with disinformation. So all these people that I've kind of named at this point are individuals who you could say are very pro-science, and want it, and in that case are not coming from this as sort of pushing, any sort of bunk kinds of things across that spectrum. But they are, by these kinds of just asking questions kinds of approaches, or trying to paint themselves as sort of the outside loner viewpoint, that the public really believes in, that kind of idea of, science. It feeds into these ideas that, like, science is not listening to certain people who might have really good ideas, and to a lay audience they might sound like that is the answer. But we know that science that works great in Hollywood. There's the lone genius against the establishment, and that's not how the science community works. And there are lots of it's sort of a weird paradox. I like to think about this. For as much as many Americans who want to discount a lot of the expertise like to think about our country as this sort of, that America is this great place, sort of American exceptionalism. In a way, they're kind of discounting the fact that the United States does have a tremendous critical mass of expertise, of which has been marshaled in unprecedented ways towards trying to understand a virus that we knew very little to nothing about a year ago. And so with that, of course, there's going to be constant updates because the science is coming out in quick droves. Good science, I should emphasize with that, but just the speed of it has increased. And science doing what it does is updating its prior assumptions, its prior theories and conclusions about things, and modifying them in light of new good evidence. And of course, then from there come guideline changes that, okay, organizations like the CDC and other ones are not going to be, they're not going to hit every ball out of the park. And I think I'm being kind of kind on some of their guidelines, which they've received some criticism on. But it is a very tough game that they're playing in terms of trying to constantly stay on top of the evidence, do the best thing, and think about guidelines that could apply to everybody and not just specific sorts of individuals. And so you always kind of have to take a more conservative type of approach to a lot of things. Now, I mean, of course, we can debate the mask guidelines that they previously had and have now been revised, and other sorts of steps that they've taken. But in general, that's essentially what they have to deal with. That's their stage.
Yeah, and I mean, this week, I think it was the NIH, somebody over there, I think it was NIH, had recommended that parents wear masks around their children, vaccinated parents wear masks around their children at home. And, he caught a lot of flack from that. People were like, that's ridiculous. I'm not going to do that. And for the thing is though, like for some people that actually is a sensible recommendation, but it's only, it's for people. It's not for everybody. It's not something that most people need to be doing. And he had to retract that soon after. And but I think, to that point though, there have been some mistakes made by the government, lack of transparency, or in some cases even deception, like with masks in the beginning. Like these were credibility damaging as well, and I haven't really seen them apologize for that. Have you?
Not much. No, it's sort of moving on, or kind of, yeah. Next step. Where are we? And
Yeah.
there's some evidence to make the argument that admitting mistakes can be good for public credibility in terms of maintaining trust.
Yeah.
So
Yeah. Well, and I think like with regard to like with regard to the early statements about masking that were made, that like even now, I feel like the average person doesn't know that masks are not to protect yourself unless you've got an N95. That the other masks are not going to protect you. They're for protecting the public. I don't think that that's, and to some degree, I feel like that is the fault of the media also, because a lot of journalists, editors in particular, they have a novelty bias. That is to say that they don't want to talk about a topic that they've already talked about, because in their mind, they think that somehow their audience happened to spot some random segment that they did 4 months ago, or some article that they ran, 6 months ago, that their audience somehow remembers that to this day and references it. Like, no, they don't remember that. They if they even saw it at all. And so there's this reluctance, I think, among a lot of national media institutions to just to remind people of basic things that are relevant to this discussion, just in the exact same way that Carl Bergstrom was doing. And other science communicate, and that burden is having to fall to, individual science communicators like yourself. But the media generally isn't as interested in trying to do this stuff, would you say?
No, yeah, I mean, gosh, we could talk for another 3 hours about the media and what they've done wrong in terms of communicating. I think a lot of the points though that you just raised will also get back to this idea of our culture of individualism. And so we come to think of anything that's sort of health related or medical as sort of any sort of therapeutic or aid or anything like that as being only something for you. Take an aspirin, or take your blood pressure medication, and so a mask sort of in that same way. Whereas again, we and even with the stories tend to have a very personal. This is how it's going to affect you. Sort of element to it, which I think long preceded COVID. I think we do have. There's a tendency to. I say this with my background in sociology too. There tends to be a very over psychologizing, I guess you could say, of news stories, that everything is sort of based on sort of these personal choices and interests, when really there's sort of broader collective and community and structural types of explanations and issues that people have to be made aware of. In this case, impact upon other people. What you will do can hurt people, and I think and you see that in a lot too with the types of experts that they bring on to talk about issues. I see this on cable news all the time. It's no disrespect to, some of them are practicing physicians and they're seeing COVID cases in the ER. My hat's off to their work. Gosh, the dedication to that, is very commendable. But then they're there to answer questions related to vaccine hesitancy or pandemic response and other sorts of broader public health issues of which they really don't have a background. And so much discussion in the discourse gets centered around, again, these very individualistic doctor-patient relation type stories and anecdotes. Now, to be fair, those do resonate very well with audiences versus, getting getting somebody like me that comes on and I'm going to cite statistics and I'm going to go, and show you, maybe a graph or something like that. But at the same time, really, this is a collective crisis that has affected our nation. We could have been phrasing that in very community-oriented type ways in terms of what we have to do to help others, to help our neighbors, our communities, our loved ones, our friends, and about masks and what our duty is as Americans to kind of deal with this in a crisis. And I think that would have appealed very well, I think, to a lot of subsections of America that really are where we're seeing a lot of hesitance and sort of government, anti-government kind of reaction to things like vaccines and stuff that beforehand, the sort of non-pharmaceutical intervention type things like distancing and the like. But we don't do that. We think about again, it's even masking studies are often we have to emphasize, like this doesn't work like a typical clinical trial of where you just kind of have like you get people taking a placebo and you get people taking a drug and let's see what works out. That we always have to be thinking about, public health thinks about these things as sort of overall benefit and population benefit in terms of risk reduction. And so, so that's to me been one of the more unfortunate messaging misses, I guess you could say, in terms of what we've seen in the media.
Yeah. It's, and it's, I think the underlying, issue with all this stuff is that there's been, I don't think there has been enough education both at the K-12 level all the way up to the medical school level about getting people to understand that, just because you know about something doesn't mean you understand it. Just because you can read some spreadsheet tables doesn't mean you should talk about them. And
a
just
research
because
article abstract would be
that's right. Or you read an article one time and therefore you know about it. Or you've seen ivermectin work on your horse or your dog, and therefore it's going to work on you. That's not how knowledge is, and that's not what the scientific method is. But it looks like a lot of people simply have no idea about what the scientific method is, and that change within science is like, that's how it works. Like changing your mind continually is the scientific method. Do people understand that at all, do you think? Some people do, but not most, would you say?
I think there's a significant portion of the population that doesn't understand that. I think they see this constant updating of science. Again, this is science at warp speed in essence relative to so many other scientific topics. So it really has been rather amazing too, seeing this constant updating and refinement of ideas. And I think they take that very much as, well, science doesn't know what it's doing. It's a public that is used to, in science education, things like gravity. It's a settled thing, or other, maybe some other laws of the universe. And not the idea that really the vast majority of science, and it's the reason why there still is science and it's just not a done deal anymore, is because there's so many questions and things that we don't understand, and we continue to pursue that. Also, at the same time, I think with related to health, I mean, we put kind of our faith to go to a doctor. Something is bothering us, and the doctor will know what exactly that it is, and that's it. And so, I mean, obviously, then there's the distrust issues of physicians and the like, but generally speaking, I mean, I think our culture has been kind of socialized into that's the answer, and here's where you do it, and here's where we go from there. Issues in the vast majority of cases, and so now to see that also is disconcerting to people. Wow, doctors kind of saying, they kind of might not even be explicitly saying they don't know. In my career, I've run across a lot of MDs that seem to have an inability to say, I don't know on something. And I think that is part of the culture of medicine. In many respects, I think a lot of MDs are socialized into that kind of thinking in terms of being the expert and being knowledgeable about that. But, I mean, it's not to paint the entire field with one broad brush, but I think that is certainly a field of expertise of which we've come to expect a definitive kind of answer on. And so to hear people that might be unclear about something or might be now changing their opinion, If you went to the doctor for that about, a common cold or, or I don't know, some, your elbow that's bothering you, yeah, you'd probably too, start to wonder about the credibility of them and have some sorts of doubts about it. And so that also that hasn't helped things as well.
Yeah. Well, and it's, and I think it overall what we've had so much, to some degree, people have talked about this idea of an authority crisis in our culture. But in a lot of ways, I think it's better to call it it's an epistemic problem. That is the idea of knowledge. How does knowledge even work? How is it
Yeah.
acquired? How do you, is it okay not to know something? And the answer is it is okay not to know something. And continually modifying how you look at the world yourself. Like that's how you have a better life. That's how you find better careers for yourself. That's how you find better relationships, better friends, and maintain the ones you have. That's what we need. But a lot of our cultural institutions, like in more, let's say, more fundamentalist religion, tells people that these things are absolute truths and they exist forever and they apply all the time. But then people who buy into that worldview, even they don't believe it in every instance themselves. So, like for instance, the Bible says that women should not speak in church. Well, I can bet you that most churches out there, except for maybe the most strict fundamentalist churches, do allow women to speak sometimes in church, in appropriate or specific ways, depending on the church. But or you shouldn't, there's a lot of people who see themselves as like in the Jewish community, a lot of people will say, yes, I'm a practicing Jew, but I like bacon. And you know what? That's fine for them to like bacon. Like they see it as, well, that's a nuance in my specific instance because that's my favorite food, so it's okay, or whatever, whatever their justification is. So they don't even practice that idea in their own life about a framework that's meaningful to them. But it's hard for them to understand that idea of nuance is very important to science and how it works.
Most certainly, yeah. The being raised Catholic, I can say that there's always Catholics seem to be very good at sort of justifying how they can get around certain things. Yeah, and it is tough, and I think this gets at really. I mean, there's so many, it bridges religion in a way. I mean, I think it really just fits into much more about a sort of confirmation bias that we kind of really have hardwired into our brains, where we really do want to seek out things that really kind of support our worldview, and getting that cognitive dissonance or that discomfort from coming face to face with information that just doesn't support your worldview, even potentially very conclusive evidence with it, is not can be very unsettling to people.
Yeah.
But yet at the same time, it's funny to think, there are certain there's certain experts that people. Well, we can certainly think that there's experts that people challenge. I mean, I get it thrown at me an awful lot. I'm a professor and I must have some sort of liberal bias, or there's some other sorts of ways to try to discredit some objective finding or whatever it is that I have. But there's lots of other experts that don't get discredited, or we don't really sort of challenge their expertise on. And so there is an interesting double standard with this. I believe it was Tom Nichols who wrote the book The Death of Expertise, who once used an example of you could get online. Yeah, he's a professor too, and he says I get challenged all the time on things related to politics. He says, but I'll bet those same people don't hop on board an airplane and start challenging the pilot while they're there, or or we'll go to an accountant, or we show up to court, we want a lawyer. And so there are these I mean, the world's full of these sorts of double standards in terms of our viewpoints. But for science, some of this and the very technical sorts of elements of it. It's also been sort of raised that this is, can sometimes be viewed as maybe being elitist. And so there's sort of maybe a little bit of a reaction against that. And I think there could be something to that too. But at the same time, I mean, I'm very impressed with for all the bad stuff, we kind of see online with misinformation and or unintended maybe information, depending on the role of the influencers, however you want to think about their role in this. There's an awful lot of researchers and academics and others who are out there trying to do good in terms of communicating things to the public in ways that we've not seen before, and really addressing that the old slur that the academy was really an ivory tower, and that we were out of touch, and that we really don't engage with people anymore. And so in a way, I've seen that as, if there's anything positive you can kind of pull out of a pandemic, so maybe this is just a bad way to sort of frame it. We do have that, and that has been a nice thing to see. And I've seen it for a few years now in the vaccine space as well. People trying to debunk information. It's unfortunate that it's needed. But it's there, and I think some of it of the disinformation has arisen out of a hole that has been or a gap that's not been filled by, I think, experts kind of doing more sort of public communication sort of things. We get a Neil deGrasse Tyson, but we don't get too many sort of public scientists out there kind of doing that kind of work.
Yeah. No, I agree. We definitely need more of that. And, and it is, I think it's always great to see, individual Twitter users or YouTube commenters, calling misinformation out, medical misinformation out when they see it, and giving specific citations for what they mean. And actually, so we had a question before we started. One of our viewers had asked, what are some great places where I can go to find, good resources to debunk these types of arguments? Can you address that?
Yeah. So the question was specific to, if I recall correctly, around vaccine misinformation, just as just an introduction and sort of a bridge from what I was just talking about too. It's been fascinating. I gave credit here to like academics and researchers, but so much of the the information or disinformation debunking that you see online is very grassroots, and so there are a lot of individuals who are just might have a science background, might not, but try to do good with this, and sort of either post or try to challenge misinformation when it's put up there. And so there's a couple different examples. So one of them would be one great resource is called vaxopedia.org, pedia.org, which is run by a physician, and two other ones, skepticalraptor.com, which is a site and sort of a blog that's run, if I recall correctly, the person was a pharmaceutical scientist, and posts really good information, helpful information on lots of different elements related to vaccine misinformation, including legal aspects of it, and some of the laws and policies and regulations around it that can be very helpful. And one of my colleagues, who's a legal scholar, posts work on there a lot, Dory Rubenstein-Rees at UC Hastings. That's very useful. And then another one that comes, there are several of these, but these are just a couple that come to mind. Another one might seem a little bit of an unusual name, is by an individual who's an MD, emergency medicine physician. It's Doc Bastard, BASTARD, as the name goes, .net, which has this really great, also like Vaxopedia, sort of encyclopedia, the way it's kind of indexed and archived around particular disinformation streams. And I would say a lot of these also play over to other elements that we've kind of seen with COVID too. So even though they might be more directly sort of focused on vaccinations, we can kind of, because of how the anti-vaccine movement is so moved into this COVID and anti-public health space, a lot of these issues, kind of cover that element, this kind of new evolution, you could say, to a certain extent.
Yeah, and one that I would recommend also to people, there's one called Science-Based Medicine, which does a lot of nice debunking on vaccine and other COVID disinformation out there.
That's much more of a David Gorski is a great resource on this. It's been doing this for years. And that would be, I was thinking that's less for sort of specific information. That's much more for, he'll have some, I shouldn't say it's less for specific. It's very specific, but it's much more sort of blog oriented versus if you have a specific issue or question related to ingredients in vaccines or things like that, then maybe a Vaxipedia or these other sites might be better. But Gorski does these fantastic diagnoses of particular claims and schemes, even in certain cases, and individuals who are very prominent online who are spreading disinformation. So glad you raised it.
Yeah. All right. Well, so this has been a great conversation, Rich, and I appreciate you joining me. So I'm going to put on the screen your Twitter information, just so the audience can see it. But for those who are listening on the podcast version, when this comes out, it's RMCAR and then piano, like the instrument. So that's your Twitter spot. Are you putting your work, publishing it elsewhere, or where else can people find you?
Well, I have a link there to my own website, and so that's where I try to keep things updated with any sort of public work that I might be doing. But generally, if you follow me on my Twitter site, you'll get most of the stuff that I'm up to, as well as sort of my my comments and thoughts on latest issues that might be coming up, or any sort of disinformation, or even misleading sorts of reporting, or things that could lead to confusion, I should say, not intentionally misleading, but things that might be sort of confusing. I try to clarify those things to the public, related to policy issues, related to general social science, and other issues related to COVID, as well as other public health matters.
Okay, cool. All right. Well, thanks for joining us today.
Well, thanks so much for having me. This has been a lot of fun.
Yeah. All right. Great. All right. So just a little bit of housekeeping for everybody. So I just wanted to remind everybody that Theory of Change is also on Twitter and the internet. So the website is theoryofchange.show, and the Twitter handle is @theorychange. And Theory of Change is part of a larger media network called Flux. So I encourage you to check that out. The website address of that is flux.community. And we're trying to do something very different to provide in-depth coverage to larger matters of politics, of religion, and of public health and science. So it's a website that is open to contributions, writing contributions. If you have a podcast you want to tell us about, feel free to jump on there and let us know what you're doing. And we also have a Patreon. If you want to support our work, it's patreon.com/discoverflux. So thank you for joining me, everybody, and I'll see you next time.